Let's talk demography, specifically Greece's demographic crisis. Now, this has been discussed for years, but recently Elon Musk brought attention to this in this now famous tweet. So in terms of population, Greece has low fertility rates, an aging population, and significant immigration, commonly called the brain drain. Of course, the demographic crisis is both caused by the economic crisis and it exacerbates it. But limiting discussions of demography to economy alone is very myopic. And so let's talk about the multiple factors at play here and the potential solutions. But first, a quick and dirty on demography in Greece. In 2009, Greece's population was around 11.1 million, and now it's currently at around 10.4 million. Over 2/3 of Greeks live in urban areas, with Athens at 4 million. But let's focus first on those numbers. 10.4 million population and around 4 million in Athens. That skew alone should set off alarm bells. But we'll come back to this shortly. Greece is also the EU's second poorest country in terms of GDP per capita, coming after Bulgaria. It currently spends around 1 billion euros on pro-child measures, but despite this, Greece still recorded its lowest ever number of births in 2022. Politicians, think tanks, and people tend to place the blame primarily on one factor, but I want to explain how there's more going on. The easy scapegoat for the demographic problem is Greece's financial crisis. And this triggered a population drop of around 800,000 in 15 years due to emigration, primarily young professionals seeking work abroad, and a plummeting birth rate. So now let's do a deeper dive and get into the roots of the problem to better understand why proposed solutions have been addressing the symptoms instead of the cause. First, let's talk about the reverse age pyramid. Greece has one of the oldest populations in Europe, with 22% of the population aged over 65, and it's steadily rising. Life expectancy is high. It's about 83 on average. So when birth rates are already low, this high life expectancy contributes to flipping the age pyramid. Why is this an issue? That's easy. Because having more old people who are dependent on the output of the working age population burdens society and the economy and will make it difficult to effectively support retirees in the future. So with a declining working age population, which is between the ages of 15 and 64, economic productivity and tax revenue are reduced, making it harder to fund pensions, healthcare, and infrastructure. And currently, about 16% of Greece's GDP supports the pension retirement system. And Greece's labor force is projected to shrink by 20% by 2050. Of course, this is not an issue exclusive to Greece. Countries around the world are facing the same problem, including the US. A quick look at the birth rate of baby boomer generation compared to Gen X millennials will paint a very similar picture. And you can Google the silver tsunami if you want more on this. So we briefly talked economy, reverse pyramid. Now let's get to point 3, fertility rate. Greece's fertility rate is famously below replacement level and has been for decades. And to put it crassly, this means that just more people die than are being born. To be exact, the fertility rate is around 1.3 to 1.4 per woman versus a replacement level being 2.1. Now, why has this been happening? Well, first off, for nearly 20 years, Greece has suffered from economic instability. During the 2008 financial crisis and the subsequent years, there was high unemployment, reduced wages, and austerity measures. And young couples tend to delay or forego having children if they don't have assurance of financial security. Second point, the cost of childcare is high relative to the wages in Greece. So if couples do decide to have children, they are restricted by this cost and plan their family accordingly. 3, urbanization and centralization in Athens specifically, and in other bigger cities to a lesser extent. Big cities generally have lower birth rates because of the practical complications and expense of raising large families in confined areas with an unsupportive infrastructure. Now, if close to 40% of your population lives in Athens, there's your biggest problem right there. This is grossly untenable for many reasons. With a population decline, rural areas, think countryside, but especially borders and islands, are hit the hardest. So now population decline also becomes an issue of national security. And without populations on the borders, a number of very obvious and dangerous problems emerge for the country. 4, global social trends. Higher rates in education mean that people get married and start their families later in life, especially when they want to live in urban settings, which takes us back to point 3 about urbanization. Point 5, the brain drain. Greece has seen waves of generational immigration. And since the financial crisis, educated professionals, around 5% of the population, left for other European countries, the US, and other places. And one of the many problems with this is not only losing the educated elite, and you're losing these potentially innovative minds who often find great success and make significant impacts in their new host countries, but let's talk about the sunk cost factor. Greece invests in education of professionals. So for example, think doctors who go to Greece for med school and therefore are an expense on Greece's stressed educational system. And then they move to Germany or the UK, let's say, and they're employed there as doctors. So now Germany or England receives an educated and trained doctor at no cost, whereas Greece has invested in the education of a doctor who is then essentially exported, leaving Greece with no benefit, only the sunk cost. And of course, this is spread across sectors. Think engineers, computer science, the humanities. All of these skilled workers leave Greece, with Greece footing the education bill. Now their absence depletes the workforce and the tax base. So these people, for educational and professional reasons, they leave Greece, which means fewer potential parents, lower birth rates, crumbling economy, because there are less people to support the tax base and help boost the economy in their own right. So now that we've outlined the factors, what's been done so far? Successive governments have introduced underfunded or poorly implemented superficial and short-term solutions. They're flashes in a pan, really. They use cheap, populist ploys that are ineffective, like offering small tax breaks for families in the form of like a monthly subsidy for families with more than 2 children, maybe a free bus pass for the family, childcare subsidies to a small extent, things like that. But relative to Europe, Greece has limited affordable childcare options, parental leave incentives, and that kind of thing. So for me, the bigger problem is that you have successive corrupt governments and dynastic politicians. Think Mitsotakis family, Papadreou family, Karamanlis family. Greece has an obsession with political dynasties to its detriment. And you have cronyism. You have bureaucratic inefficiency. You have politicians who merely want to secure their succession in the political landscape and, of course, enhance their political wealth, rather than work to provide actual solutions to existential problems in the country. So in 2023, the Mitsotakis government created the Ministry of Social Cohesion and Family, and this was tasked with a demographic challenge. So one example of one of their initiatives was a one-time birth grant. It was a 2,000 euro push present for the mom. They offered daycare vouchers to subsidize childcare costs. There's financial assistance for IVF. They've been offering affordable housing initiatives like loans for first home purchase for young couples. They didn't put a caveat to say that to get these loans, these houses should be in the countryside. So it's just rooting more people in Athens instead of trying to decentralize the country, which would actually help alleviate the root causes of demographic decline, like I discussed before. They have a Rebrain Greece initiative to try to bring back highly skilled Greeks who emigrated during the economic crisis. But these solutions offered are very myopic and don't address the root of the problem. They're simply throwing money at it on a superficial level. I've even read these ridiculous propositions from think tanks in Greece and in the Greek diaspora that want to repopulate Greece with professionals from abroad, essentially the same Mitsotakis idea. But what they don't realize is that by transplanting Greeks from abroad into a failing system is like putting a Band-Aid on a hemorrhage. So these newly transplanted Greeks will start to rebuild their lives in Greece, only to realize what those of us who already live here already know. Having children is an incredibly difficult life choice because of a crumbling healthcare system, a horrible education system, and a grossly Athens-centered political mindset. It'll have accomplished nothing except temporarily shuffle people into and out of Greece. And the reason for this is you can't expect people to move to Greece and suddenly want to have large families in spite of all the huge problems that make having a large family here difficult to begin with. You need to first address the actual reasons why couples are restricting their family planning. So all of this initiative and these ideas have done is just funneled more money into these like senseless think tanks that do very superficial analyses and do limited intellectual labor on critical issues like demographic decline. So what needs to happen? A very serious and foundational restructuring of the public education system for starters, from elementary to university. As a diaspora Greek who returned to Greece, it is a serious concern that I can't depend on sending my children to public school because they're underfunded, staffed with uninspired, unmotivated, or jaded educators, or because they're subject to protests and school shutdowns on a whim. As a working parent, I want to be able to depend on sending my child to school in the morning and know that my child will come back safe and having learned the material. I also need to point out that because the public education system is such a failure, parents are forced to pay exorbitant costs to private tutoring to ensure their children learn the material and are able to pass the Panhellenic exams in the end of the senior year. So kids go to school, often return reporting they've learned nothing. Then they go to after-school tutoring to actually learn the material. And this is so ridiculous, and it's a large reason why couples avoid having large families, because planning for their child's education is incredibly difficult and very costly. And so parents with the means will take their kids out of the public school system, enroll them into a private school. But this is untenable, and of course it's untenable on a large scale. Not everybody can afford a private school for their children, for kindergarten through high school. Other factors restricting openness to having a large family is the healthcare issue. If someone in my family gets sick, I'm forced to take them to a private hospital just to ensure that they're going to get proper and safe care, especially in a timely manner. Additionally, let's say I work remotely and I can live in a village. Oftentimes the nearest hospital is hours away. Or if I live on an island, it's an emergency helicopter ride away to Athens, to the nearest major hospital. Now I either live in the comfort of a village and can physically have the large family and the space for it, but I live far away from reliable medical care. Or I'm forced to move to Athens to be in proximity to a hospital, but now I'm physically restricted from having a large family because I can only afford a 2-bedroom in Athens, and so that restricts how many children I'm going to want to have. See how that works? So if the educational and medical systems aren't fixed first, no 2,000 euro push presents from the government are going to convince me to have multiple children. 2,000 is just for the birth. Who's going to help me with the more significant and costly parts of child rearing that actually impact my child's future? The 2,000 was a drop in the bucket. The solutions offered by this government and these 2-bit think tanks are also incredibly male-oriented. In most cases, women carry the burden of childbirth and raising a family. So the solutions should be oriented towards alleviating the stress and risk to the woman. Otherwise, she won't have the security and won't feel comfortable and confident having multiple children. So how do you fix this? Well, first you have to provide long-lasting financial security initiatives. I should throw this out there that the divorce rate in Greece is around 38%. There are no official published numbers on alimony delinquency, but and I recognize that this is personal, but in the sample of the network of divorced women with children across Greece that I know, the heavy majority do not receive child support from the father of their children. So assuming that this is a relatively normal occurrence, and it's not limited to my specific social network, women who've had children are not provided financial security because the government doesn't offer sufficient legal protection against something as foundational as receiving financial support from the father of their children. So if women aren't guaranteed permanent financial stability after giving birth in the instance of divorce, while raising their family, it'll be hard to convince young women to become mothers, especially if all they see in their social networks is women who are consistently struggling to raise their children on a single income because there's a legal system that doesn't advocate for women by prosecuting alimony delinquency. The other issue is these measures, like the ones proposed by the Mitsotakis government, are created by one administration and can be rescinded by the next. So if one government offers a 2,000 push present or a 200 euro annual stipend, for example, the mother is not guaranteed that in the next administration. And this could crash the family's financial stability if that's what they've come to depend on. So there needs to be commitment to long-term funding, a commitment to a 20-year demographic plan with guaranteed funding insulated from political changes. This means the government needs to enforce policy that will actually provide women with a stable financial future for them and their family. And you can do this by facilitating transfers of property to mothers, tying their social security to their children and their children's output. That way, a woman receives a permanent financial benefit from having birthed children who in turn contribute to their tax base, which ultimately supports their own mother's retirement, right? You can create loans for female-run businesses. In short, you transfer economic power to the hands of women, and you give them the confidence and security to have large families. You expand vocational training for women and for their children. You create job security for women who will now know that they can raise children who will also have job security. Most women think years into their future and into the future of their children. By nature, women are practical thinkers, and they have an innate concern for the well-being of their offspring. So the Greek government needs to lean into this and provide solutions to these concerns of women. Greece needs to target couples when they're young. They need to offer them the ability to move to the countryside, where having children is both healthier for childhood and rearing. It's more tenable in a village that has a solid school system with a local hospital and helps secure Greek borders to boot. This would stimulate the local economy and therefore the national economy. And you can't talk about solutions for demographic crisis without targeting regional revitalization. Governments need to incentivize young couples and families to settle in rural areas by offering land grants, targeted loans, or business startup funds. And you can't talk about regional revitalization without addressing infrastructure upgrades. You need to improve transport. So if somebody is commuting from the village to the city, you need to be able to provide reliable transportation for them to do this on the daily. You need to subsidize relocation to depopulated regions like Ipiros, Evros, and the islands. You need to support agricultural innovation. You do this by supporting young farmers with grants for sustainable agriculture and agrotourism, which would boost rural economies and reverse urban migration. You need to address educational access. Greece needs to ensure high-quality schools and universities are accessible in Athens and Thessaloniki, but of course, outside of those major urban centers. And of course, there needs to be a cultural campaign. Soft power is incredibly effective for deep-seated change. It's a long-term investment, but it pays off. If the majority of TV shows in Greece are centered around Athens, and if news is centered around Athens, and if in reality living in Athens in a tiny apartment with more than one child is not tenable, then you're reinforcing this idea that the ultimate Greek dream is to live in Athens. But that's shooting yourself in the foot because that's one of the causes for your demographic crisis. So TV shows should be about village life. Documentaries should showcase more of the positive aspects of life in the countryside. And the news should finally concern itself with the lives of the majority of Greeks, not just Athenians. Greece is not Athens, but you really wouldn't know this from watching the news or TV here. And if you think I'm over-exaggerating, watch the news for a half an hour. Any standard news program. The heavy majority is Athens-centered news. And if you think I'm over-exaggerating for the TV aspect, watch Maestro in Blue on Netflix and read it for the unbelievable Athenian bias that it has. Just for example, if you know the premise, think about how all the young characters are repeatedly talking about how they want to leave their backwards island full of these closed-minded yokels, and they want to get to Athens where they can finally be free. And the characters in Athens talk about their lives there like they're in the center of culture, and life outside of it in the eparchia or in the hinterland is so bleak. I'm not kidding. Watch the show, again if you need to, and tell me there's not a heavy Athenian bias. And this goes for so many TV shows in Greece. They might not say it overtly, but the fact that every single comedy sitcom, this kind of bubblegum TV shows, they're centered around an Athenian apartment, Athenian lifestyle. This tells you the mindset that Greece is Athens. And that's the big problem. So to wrap up, all of these factors contribute to why women are less willing to have multiple kids, or even kids to begin with. Life outside of Athens needs to be promoted. The countryside needs to be repopulated because when people have the physical space and the educational system and the medical system and a legal system that offers them security and an economic system that supports them, Greece won't have a population decline. Greece will have a population boom.